On the money, President Trump unveils his plan to rebuild America's roads and highways. We'll have a report from the White House. Illegal immigration. The Senate begins an open-ended debate on the fate of the Dreamers. Revisiting history, we reflect on the resignation of Pope Benedict 5 years later. And setting records. We'll introduce you to a husband and wife married for more than 80 years. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, February 12th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. President Trump launches what he's calling a big week for infrastructure. Today, he unveiled his $1.5 trillion proposal to rebuild American roads and highways. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The president says U.S. infrastructure is crumbling, and with a play on words, he said Washington no longer will be a roadblock to progress. Today, the White House is revealing what that progress will cost.
This morning, I submitted legislative principles to Congress that will spur the biggest and boldest infrastructure investment in American history.
President Trump continues on the road he first paved on the campaign trail, a call for more investment in the U.S. He says spending $7 trillion on wars in the Middle East was a mistake.
We're trying to build roads and bridges and fix bridges that are falling down, and we have a hard time getting the money. It's crazy.
His plan to restore the roadways calls for $1.5 trillion total, but relies heavily on infrastructure investment from local, state, and tribal governments, as well as private companies. $200 billion in federal funds would be spent.
The vast majority of Americans want to see us take care of our infrastructure.
The president calls it a common sense and bipartisan plan that every member of Congress should support. But it's not convincing Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. The Democrat from New York says the president's infrastructure proposal would do very little to make our ailing infrastructure better, but it would put unsustainable burdens on our local government and lead to Trump tolls all over the country. The White House budget for 2019 was also unveiled and unpacked today on Capitol Hill. It represents a $4 trillion wish list of spending. Though thick with pages, it doesn't carry much weight. That's because last week, Congress passed its own 2-year budget framework, a rare deal that got the president's signature and Senator Schumer's approval.
It's a significant achievement, a genuine bipartisan breakthrough.
Schumer and the other lawmakers on Capitol Hill now have the chance to see all the specifics of the president's infrastructure priorities in a 55-page legislative outline that the Trump administration has released as Congress attempts to craft a bill. Lauren.
Mark, how soon could we actually see new roads and bridges?
Well, the president says he wants to speed up the approval process so that projects can get the green light in less than 2 years, maybe even less than a year. But again, you can't get there until Congress passes a bill.
If. White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. President Trump isn't just showering billions on rebuilding roads and highways. The military is seeing an increase in its budget, the biggest the Pentagon has ever seen. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby joins us with how the Defense Department will spend the money. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. The president has proposed $716 billion in total for national security in the 2019 budget. Officials here at the Pentagon say the increase means they can pay for newer equipment and more training. The total is far more than America's closest competitors, China and Russia, but the department's top financial officer says it's necessary to stay on top.
We recognize that if unaddressed, the eroding U.S. military advantage versus China and Russia could undermine our ability to deter aggression and coercion in key strategic regions.
Undersecretary David Norquist echoing similar words to his boss, Defense Secretary James Mattis, who says the increase is needed to pull the military out of a slump and better focus on the fight in Afghanistan and the potential threat from North Korea. Mattis has also mentioned how important it is the military doesn't spend all the money on one enemy or one threat. Instead, he says it's about being ready to confront a broad series of problems like improving missile defense and upgrading the country's nuclear arsenal. Lauren.
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the Pentagon. Thank you, Wyatt. Donald Trump Jr.'s wife is taken to the hospital as a precaution after opening an envelope containing an unidentified white powder. 40-year-old Vanessa Trump opened a letter addressed to her husband and began coughing and feeling nauseous. A preliminary test indicates the substance was not dangerous, but New York police and the Secret Service are investigating. A White House aide says he's confident the president will release a memo by Democrats once it has been, quote, cleaned up. The president tweets he told Democrats to, quote, redo and send back in proper form. The memo is expected to defend the FBI's investigation into possible collusion by Russia in the 2016 election. A Republican memo released earlier this month alleged abuses of surveillance powers by the FBI. Immigration reform finally makes it to the Senate floor. Senators launch a rare, open-ended debate on the controversial issue. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi tells us more. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. An immigration deal has eluded lawmakers for years. Today, 7 Republican senators are introducing President Trump's plan. That includes billions for border security and protections for young immigrants. The Senate Majority Leader has promised an immigration debate, but no one can say if anything will pass. The Senate's top Democrat and Republican share the stage, and that gesture of bipartisanship is a must, since any immigration deal in the Senate needs 60 votes.
This week will be a test of whether the Senate can steer the ship of state through the stormiest of waters.
President Trump is key. It's unlikely a Senate deal will pass the more conservative House without his backing.
We're building the wall, believe me.
The president wants $25 billion for border security, including a wall.
If the Democrats want to make a deal, it's really up to them, because we want really tremendous border security, but we have to have Democrat support for DACA.
That program allows immigrants brought to the country illegally as children to work and study. The president's plan would provide a pathway to citizenship to 1.8 million of those dreamers. For months, they've been speaking out on Capitol Hill.
What will I do if I can't work? I cannot provide for my own schooling, and that for me is my biggest fear.
Religious leaders are urging lawmakers to protect them.
We cannot underestimate the horrible anxiety under which a large majority of these young people live.
So many dreamers and others are in our churches. They're the ones leading ministries within our congregations. We know them. They're our brothers and sisters in Christ. So these aren't abstract issues. These are real people for us.
Now, here's a look at some of the other plans. One would provide possible citizenship to dreamers and $2.7 billion for border security. Another would offer the dreamers legal status and money to study border security. Now, President Trump has rejected both of those proposals, so the Senate will have to keep on working. Lauren?
President Trump imposed a March 5th deadline for Congress to take action on dreamers. Will Congress make that deadline?
Lauren, that deadline is actually on hold, taking the pressure off of Congress. A federal court has forced the administration to continue the Obama-era protections, so we'll have to wait and see if the Senate can cut a deal.
All right, Jason Calvi, Capitol Hill correspondent. Thank you, Jason. Joining us now is Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief for The Hill, to make sense of it all. Welcome back, Bob.
Hey, Laura.
Any movement on that immigration deal that you're hearing about?
Well, I think something could come out of the Senate. I think it might take longer than just a week to get it through. But the question is, even if you get something through the Senate, we've seen this in recent years, 4 or 5 years ago, the Senate passed a bill, but the House didn't act on it. So that's going to be, I think there's a will in the Senate to get it done. But as far as a deal in the House in an election year, I think that's going to be very difficult.
An American budget, efficient, effective, and accountable. This is the tomb right there, filled with all of that interesting information, including that $1.5 trillion for infrastructure. But, you know, what's not in here is balancing the budget.
Yeah.
And that really abandons the GOP's longtime commitment to doing just that. And it isn't even a faraway goal in what we're seeing here. Aren't conservative Republicans angry?
Well, I've talked to some conservatives, and you know what they're talking about? They're talking about when President George W. Bush was in the White House and Congress was controlled by Republicans. And what happened? Spending went through the roof. So they are concerned about this transportation plan, especially after passing this budget bill, which many conservatives voted against, as well as the tax cut plan, which we're talking $1 trillion deficits. The official deficit statement will be released in October, right before the election, and it's likely going to be over $1 trillion.
And that's going to hurt a lot of people when it comes to the polls, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it could. I mean, there are a lot of people in America, maybe not in the Washington Beltway, who care about the debt and the deficit. And that coming out right before the election, that could hurt Republican turnout.
I just heard that White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders continued to field questions today about the top aide, Rob Porter.
Yeah.
And she said that the allegations against him for beating his wives should not be the determining factor. Everybody deserves due process. The president said that, but the White House is getting slammed for this one.
Yeah.
Can it recover?
I think so, but it's very chaotic right now. I mean, it's been chaotic 2017, but this is really bad because they haven't gotten their story straight. They've changed it. And also, Chief of Staff General Kelly, this is the first time he's been under intense pressure and a lot of speculation about his future. This story is now going into its second week. The White House just has to make sure it gets one story out, the truth, hopefully, and then it might fade away. But it's obviously a very serious issue.
Before we go, Nancy Pelosi, minority leader, called the president's infrastructure plan a puny scam, which I thought was an interesting way. It's kind of a letdown. It is, because $200 billion of that $1.5 trillion is federal money. That's it.
Yeah.
So are we going to be able to see? I don't understand if we could actually see Senate Democrats get on board with this.
I don't think so. And you know, $200 billion, that's too much for conservatives, but it's nowhere near enough for Democrats. So even though this is an issue that could have attracted bipartisanship, a lot of people said maybe Trump should have started with transportation right after getting sworn into office. I don't see this moving very far.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief for The Hill.
Thanks, Lauren.
71 people die in a plane crash outside Moscow. Emergency workers found both flight data recorders while searching through debris. Investigators have ruled out a terrorist attack, but they won't speculate on reasons for the deadly accident. The plane crashed minutes after takeoff. 8 people, including 3 children, are dead and at least 40 injured at a Mardi Gras parade in Bolivia. It happened when a canister of gas exploded. Police believe hot oil spilled and burned a hose connected to a tank, releasing gas that caused that explosion. Israel says it delivered, quote, severe blows to Iranian and Syrian forces in weekend airstrikes. The offensive was in response to the Syrian army shooting down an Israeli fighter jet. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tells his cabinet the country will, quote, continue to strike any attempt to strike us. The attacks are Israel's most serious response to neighboring Syria's civil war since it began in 2011. U.S. officials tell CNN an ISIS leader was wounded in an airstrike last May near Raqqa, Syria. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was sidelined for several months. Al Jazeera reports he suffered serious injuries to his legs. It is unclear if that strike came from Russian or coalition aircraft. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister is headed home after a whirlwind 3 days at the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. Kim Yo-jong met Saturday with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. She says her brother wants a summit between the two leaders aimed at ending 7 decades of hostility. On Friday, she watched the opening ceremony seated near U.S. Vice President Mike Pence and his wife. Pence did not acknowledge her. Many conservatives condemned mainstream media for their positive coverage of her visit to the Games. And speaking of the Olympics, Norway leads the medal count with 9 total, including 2 golds. Germany, the Netherlands, and Canada are ahead of the U.S. We're in 5th place with 2 golds in snowboarding, 1 silver in luge, and 1 bronze in team figure skating. Celebrations for the Chinese New Year are taking place all over the world, including the historic Piazza del Popolo in Rome. Groups from Italy and China perform traditional dances honoring the Year of the Dog, which begins Friday. 5 years ago, Pope Benedict stunned the world by announcing his resignation.
In gravescente etate, non iam aptas esse ad monus Petrinum eque administrandum.
The German pontiff communicated his decision to cardinals in the Vatican in Latin. It shocked the church and the entire world. Vatican correspondent Juliette Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliette, remind us what happened next.
Well, it's certainly poignant that Benedict chose the World Day of the Sick to announce that he was resigning the papacy on the grounds of his failing health. He said that he was resigning as of the end of February, and when that 28th of February came round, it was a truly memorable day. The Vatican orchestrated it to perfection, and all of us will never forget those images of the Pope getting in the helicopter and flying off into the sunset towards Castel Gandolfo, the papal countryside residence. Now, within 2 weeks, a new Pope had been elected, and Jorge Maria Bergoglio took over as Pope Francis on March 13th, 2013.
Last week, I remember the Pope Benedict said he's on a pilgrimage home. Really sort of brought out feelings and wondering if he's okay. How is his health?
Well, indeed, he wrote that this last stretch of the road is at times tough, and those that we know, even colleagues of ours who have met him in recent times, state precisely that it is his physical frailty that is most startling, if you want, but his lucidity of mind is quite incredible, and we understand that he still says Mass with help, and he sometimes is accompanied by Monsignor Georg Genswein, and he says Mass on a Sunday. And he has also said, as he wrote in the letter to Corriere della Sera, he wrote, he is blessed to be surrounded by a love and a goodness that he hadn't imagined.
Pope Benedict was the first pope to resign in 600 years. I think we forget that. That's 600 years, a big chunk of time. Pope Francis has also talked about the possibility. Did Pope Benedict start a trend?
Well, I don't know if we can talk about a trend. He has certainly set a precedent, if you wish, and we've had 5 years to get used to the idea of having two popes living side by side, if you will, within the Vatican walls. So certainly it's not something that can be ruled out. And the fact that Pope Francis has brought it up on several occasions means that, yes, it's not something we can just say will not happen. Before popes died, now they can possibly even step aside, I guess, if you will, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent.
Thank you.
Coming up, religious freedom. A Christian baker in San Diego refuses to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. And picture of a president. Barack Obama is back in the public eye. We'll tell you why. The University of Notre Dame modifies its decision about contraception. It says it now will provide to employees through its own insurance plan. In November, the Catholic school allowed third parties to provide birth control, but changed its mind after some of the options included abortion-inducing drugs. Cardinal Timothy Dolan thanks the Trump administration for barring U.S. taxpayer dollars from foreign organizations that perform abortions. Dolan, who is chairman of the Bishops' Committee on Pro-Life Activities, released a statement saying, in part, quote, U.S. tax dollars have no business going to organizations that are unwilling to pursue health outcomes for every person. In a report released last week, all but 4 of nearly 750 foreign aid organizations complied with the rule known as the Mexico City policy. A Christian baker, this time in California, refused to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple and wins a preliminary ruling in court. A judge denies the state's request for an injunction. That would have forced Kathy Miller either to create cakes for same-sex couples' weddings or stop altogether making cakes. Miller says, I am very happy to serve everything from my cases to anybody, but I cannot be a part of a celebration that goes against my Lord and Savior. The case is not over yet. Joining us now from San Diego is Charles Lamandry of the Freedom of Conscious Defense Fund, which represents Kathy Miller. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you for having me, Lauren.
This is a win for your client. Tell me, though, do you expect a final decision in favor of your client?
We do. And in fact, we filed a motion last Friday, which should result in a final judgment that will be in favor of my client and should be enforceable to prevent any further action against her.
Yes, there was a similar case to this that is at the Supreme Court right now, very similar, heard in December. Baker Jack Phillips from Colorado refused to create a cake for a same-sex wedding, and the justices are expected to rule in June. Will your case impact that case?
It very well could. It's gotten a lot of publicity, so I can't imagine the justices on the United States Supreme Court are not aware of it. This case is a very well-reasoned decision by Judge Lampe in Bakersfield for the California Superior Court, It's 7 pages, single-spaced, and it goes through the legal analysis correctly, and we believe very persuasively. So hopefully the United States Supreme Court justices in ruling on the Masterpiece Gate case in June will be influenced by it and come down with a similar decision in favor of the First Amendment rights of Christians and all people of faith or no faith. They shouldn't have to speak. Go ahead.
No, that's all right. What's the hardest part for your client? I read that she lost 6 employees, that she has hate mail, that she lost her Yelp account.
Yes, exactly. You know, there was a backlash from the gay community and liberals that don't share her views on traditional marriage. She had to shut down all of her social media accounts that night. The media was outside her doors. It really was, we believe, a setup because a same-sex couple who went out and contacted the media immediately, then filed this complaint, it turns out was going around and audio taping other people regarding services for their wedding, and when in fact the people said they provide the service, they turn off the tape. So they were looking for someone who would not provide the service. And in this case, as soon as my client explained the reasons why she couldn't bake the cake, but she was willing to make a reasonable accommodation by sending her to a competitor baker who said that they would make the cake under these circumstances, the same-sex couple basically grabbed the custom cake form and left the store and proceeded to engage in this media campaign against her, which caused her to lose a lot of business, receive a lot of hate mail, death threats, gay pornography being sent to their firm email account and website, and a lot of vile things that they had to put up with over the past few months. On the other hand, they've received an outpouring of support from the Bakersfield community, and even before the 2-hour court hearing we had on February 2nd on this matter, there was a rally with hundreds of people that turned out to support my client from the local churches. So it's been a real opportunity for people to engage in this important controversial issue, and we're just delighted that the decision from the court was in our client's favor, and hopefully will benefit all Christians or all people of faith that may find themselves in a similar situation.
Charles Lamandry of the Freedom of Conscience Defense Fund, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren, for having me on the show.
Up next, it's a miracle. A French bishop declares another act of divine intervention. And something old, something new. A married couple in Kentucky receives an honor. The Smithsonian unveils official paintings of former President Barack Obama and his wife, Michelle. They will hang at the National Portrait Gallery here in Washington, D.C., alongside those of other former presidents. Pope Francis thanks the Prime Minister of Bangladesh for welcoming Rohingya Muslims to her country. The Holy Father received the leader in the Vatican today. More than 650,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled Myanmar for Bangladesh. The Pope has asked for a just and lasting solution to their ordeal. Francis visited both countries 2 months ago. A bishop in France declares a miracle from the Shrine of Lourdes. It's the 70th miracle, and this one involves a nun. Sister Bernadette Moriau was declared fully disabled in 1980. She visited Lourdes in 2008 when she returned home and began to pray. She says a voice told her to take off her leg braces. Surprise, she says, I could move. The bishop says there is no scientific explanation for her cure. And finally, tonight, a Catholic group holds a contest for the longest married couple and finds the winners in Kentucky. Moda and Avenel Young of Bowling Green have been married 81 years. Their wedding day was April 14th, 1936. Worldwide Marriage Encounter says it honored the couple this weekend with a Valentine's Day celebration in their hometown. Reminds me of my beautiful parents who have been married for more than a half century. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. And we leave you tonight with a look back 5 years ago this month when Pope Benedict headed into retirement. Good night, and God bless you.
Signore, perché mi chiedi questo? E che cosa mi chiedi? È un peso grande quello che mi pone sulle spalle, ma se tu me lo chiedi, sulla tua parola getterò le reti. Anch'io sento nel mio cuore di dover soprattutto ringraziare Dio che guida e fa crescere la Chiesa. Amare la Chiesa significa anche avere il coraggio di fare scelte difficili, sofferte. Non abbandono la croce, ma resto in modo nuovo presso il Signore crocifisso. Ho sempre saputo che la barca della Chiesa non è mia, non è nostra, ma è sua.